Well, welcome back. This is the second to last lecture of Introduction to IO Psychology, and we're deep into talking about organizational issues. So just as a quick reminder, again, industrial psychology is focused on that personnel psychology, selection, performance appraisal, training. The organizational side is more focused on the soft social skills and the social environment of workplace. And today we're going to be talking about leadership. And as always, make sure that you're keeping up on the assignments and projects that are due that are listed at the bottom of this slide. So we're going to be talking about leadership today. And what we're going to be looking at is leadership in general, and also the various theories that have been proposed to try to define and predict leadership. So though there's basically two things we want to think about when we talk about leadership in an organization. We want to talk about how can we improve leadership, but also how we can predict successful leadership. So a lot of the theories try to do both. They try to come up with what predicts who's going to become or emerge as a good leader. And then once someone is a leader, what behaviors, what skills, what techniques can be used to make them better leaders, to where the leadership results in, again, organizational outcomes. So we're always thinking about that open system model. The leadership usually is mainly affecting what kind of inputs are being brought in. Leadership can affect how the throughputs or the process of the organization is done, and also kind of has some effect on what the outcomes are, and uses hopefully that feedback and environmental information to guide the organization. So leadership is often directly affecting the organizational goals, and can also directly affect all of the things we've talked about so far. So good leadership has often been found to be strongly related to both productivity, but also to a lot of the other organizational outcomes we've talked about, such as individual job satisfaction and organizational commitment. So what is leadership? As always, we open with a definition: a social process through which an individual intentionally exerts influence over others to structure their behavior and relationships. So again, let's unpack that definition. So it's a social process. Leadership is a process that occurs between individuals. It is a social process. It is a process between the leader and the subordinates or the followers, and that is an exchange of information and an exchange of communication. There is an individual who is the leader, and they are intentionally exerting influence. So it's not accidental. The influence is being exerted on purpose, and that influence can take a lot of different forms, but there is an influence. In other words, the leader is trying through social processes to intentionally influence or cause changes in behavior in others. And that influence over the others is to structure their behavior and their relationships. So the leader not only is trying to change behaviors, increase productivity, increase success, increase basically the innovativeness of production teams. There is some type of behavior that is trying to be influenced or structured. But it can also be the relationships, and by relationships here, we're also talking about the creation of teams, the organizational structure. So effective leadership is a function of the outcomes produced by those being led. So truly, from an organizational viewpoint, what we really look at as far as the best benchmark of is someone being an effective leader are the overall broad outcomes of the organization, is the value of the organization, is the amount of productivity coming out of that organization, is the profitability of that organization being increased by that leadership. That is effective leadership. So the core of leadership is influencing others, by which is linked to relationship building. So we do know that to influence others, there's a lot of different ways that a leader can use to influence others, but almost all of them involve creating a relationship between the leader and the followers. Now, sometimes those relationships may be very positive socially. Sometimes they may be very tense. But it is an exchange, a social exchange, that results in that influence being exerted. And if that influence successfully changes behaviors in those being led that results to organizational outcome, that's what we would consider an effective leader to be. So let's focus for a minute on that influence. So power is an individual's potential influence over attitudes and behaviors of individuals. So when we start talking about power of the leader, does a leader have power? there's basically 5 bases of power that a leader can draw on. And this comes from French and Raven studies in 1958, where they were trying to define how do leaders influence their subordinates. So of the 5, the first one is legitimate power. So legitimate power refers to someone that actually has conferred power based on the organization. So if you have the title of manager, if you have the title of president, if you have the title of vice president, there is a certain amount of legitimate power that comes with that. In other words, all the members of the organization have recognized there is a power structure to this organization, and you have a certain amount of power. The rank of a military commander is legitimate power. The President of the United States has legitimate power. In this particular class, I have legitimate power. I am the professor. I'm in charge of the class. Reward power exists when an individual controls the rewards of others. So reward power means you may not have legitimate power, but you have the power to give out rewards. So if someone actually is in charge of determining who actually gets the bonus every month, that would be reward power. Now, a lot of times these powers are going to come together. In other words, someone that has legitimate power very well may also have reward power, but maybe not so much. So, for example, you could have a mid-level manager that has legitimate power. They are your supervisor. However, they're not the ones that make the decision of whether you get a promotion or not and whether you get a bonus or not. That happens at a higher level. They wouldn't have reward power in that case. They would have legitimate power without reward power. Coercive power is the reverse of reward power. It exists when an individual controls the punishment of others. So if someone has the ability to punish other people that are their subordinates, they have coercive power. So if you have the ability to dock someone pay, if you can send someone, give someone basically a leave of unpaid absence, if you can fire someone, those are all coercive powers. Expert power are held by someone who has specific expertise or proficiencies that are recognized by other people within the organization. So when we talk about expert power, we're starting to move away from kind of the traditional way we think of management. We tend to think of leaders as those people that have been appointed legitimate power, have the ability to both reward or coerce their employees. They could both give raises, give bonuses, but they also could fire or dock pay. Expert power can still be a powerful influence in an organization, and it basically represents someone that has knowledge or specific expertise that makes them valuable and people respect their opinion. And finally, referent power, gained when one is shown respect and admiration by others. So ideally, according to the 5 bases of power, what we'd hope for most leaders is most leaders would want to have all of these. They would want to have a legitimate position. They would want to have the ability to reward. They'd want to have the ability to coerce if necessary. You'd want to have them be recognized as being an expert that people should come to regardless of their legitimate power. And there should also be a general amount of respect and admiration shown to them by their subordinates. Referent power. Now, as an ideal leader would have all of these and therefore have a lot of different ways that they could coerce others to do the behaviors they're hoping for, a lot of times we will find situations where someone only has 1, 2, 3, some combination of these. And not always in an organization is the person with the legitimate power truly running things. A lot of times we will have a situation where there's a manager with legitimate power, but for various reasons that's pretty much the only power they have, and most people don't go to that person. They go to someone that's either seen as an expert and have expert power, or maybe even someone in the organization that is highly respected, referent power. So leaders are likely to use different types of power in managing across different situations. And that's really one of the main points I want to get across in this lecture on leadership, is we're going to talk about a lot of different theories and a lot of different models. Some of them have been well supported, some of them have been partially supported by research, some of them are currently in favor, some of them are a little bit less in favor right now. But one of the unifying features is that almost all studies, no matter how they're looking at leadership, find that when leaders are adaptable, when leaders have multiple options in how they're going to influence others and can recognize when to use different types. So in some situations you may need to use coercive power. But if you're a leader and that's the only type of power you use, you're probably in the long term not going to be an effective leader. So think of a manager that only punishes. Or think of a manager that only rewards. Generally speaking, you're wanting to set up to where you have multiple sources of power and that you know which situations each type is most useful in. So more power is not always better. Having more power and using more power is not strongly related to basically effective leadership. So again, effective leadership is, are you actually getting organizational goals done through your use of power? And what we found is that when you look at managers or leaders that have a large amount of power, that is not always a predictor of effective leadership. What's a better predictor is, do they have power and are they using it differently across different situations? Are they matching the types of power they have at their disposal to the kind of power that's needed in that situation? And also remember that expert power and referent power are not limited to necessarily the higher levels of the organization. Often expert power is someone that has a strong influence on subordinates, but maybe a subordinate themselves. So there might be 10 engineers, but on this particular project, it's a project that most of the engineers aren't familiar with, and there's one engineer that's their specialty area. They're going to have a lot of weight and a lot of influence on any decisions that group makes, even though they don't have reward, coercion, or position power. So referent power also often represents someone that's been in an organization for such a long time that everyone respects their knowledge of the organization, respects their position in the organization. I remember when I was in graduate school, the graduate secretary in the school that I went to had been there for longer than any of the professors and pretty much ran the department. And they were not running it through legitimate power or reward power or coercion power. They were running it through expert and referent power. Many times the chair of that department would try to do something, and basically they would find if that secretary blocked them, they usually wouldn't get it done because she so well knew the bureaucracy of the universe, and also everyone from the staff to the other faculty were very reverent of her. In other words, they recognized that she had this knowledge, and they respected her for it. So now we're going to talk about leadership theories. And again, each one of these theories is trying to do two things. It's trying to provide some information about how to predict who will become leaders, who will make good leaders, but also trying to predict what behaviors or what are behaviors are probably the right word. What behaviors result in effective leadership? So there's a lot of theories out there, and they can be broadly categorized as trait theories, and this basically is kind of that leadership is inborn. So the trait theories suggest that there are certain traits that are highly related with effective leadership. The behavioral theories, and that's the second one that we're going to talk about in this lecture set, the behavioral theories are focused on the idea that it isn't the traits of a person, it's how they behave in the leadership role that determines if they're effective or not. We're then going to talk about contingency theories in the next lecture set, and contingency theories are basically exactly what contingency means. It basically means it depends. These are theories that say that it's not whether you are naturally born a good leader, it's not necessarily what particular behaviors you show, it's those people that match the necessary behaviors to the current situation that are good leaders. In other words, adaptability. And finally, we're going to talk about some contemporary theories, or more modern theories of leadership, where it's really more focused not on the leader, but the actual overall environment of leadership. So trait theories, behavioral theories, and even contingency theories are a little bit focused on the leader themselves. Most contemporary theories are a little bit more about how subordinates view leaders and how that's a major influence on the success of leadership. So the trait theories of leadership is where we start with our leadership studies, and they're fairly descriptive studies. So going all the way back to those first couple of lectures, we kind of talked about the purpose of science is to describe and then to look for relationships. If you have relationships, then you look for prediction, and if you can predict, you start to look to see how you can change the situation to control that behavior. So the trait theories are really just trying to describe what is good leadership. A lot of research and theories came out from the 1930s to the 1950s, and these were all focused on identifying individual characteristics that make a good leader. So the question was, is gender important for leadership? Is dominance important for leadership? Is intelligence, appearance, need for power, need for achievement? Is there key traits, stable personality traits, or even physical traits that we can measure that will allow us to predict who will become a good leader? So most of these were atheoretical studies, and what atheoretical means is they didn't have a theory of leadership. It wasn't like they are saying, well, a good leader has these following traits for these following reasons, and now we're going to set up experiments to test to see if that's actually correct. What these studies were more of were descriptive studies. So basically they were measuring people that were leaders. They were trying to find, let's find 50 people that everyone agree are effective leaders, and now let's see, is there a common trait that we can identify in these people that would let us know that's the trait you need to look for if you want to find good leaders. Stogel's 1948 review, which is towards the end of the trait theory's kind of dominance in this field, concluded there was really no consistency in the findings of the trait leadership relationship. In other words, what that meant was that every single study that came out during this time that claimed they had found the key to leadership was not being well supported in other studies. And because of this, the interest in traits kind of waned for a while. Now, what's important to recognize before we even move on, that the trait theories were trying to find a universal trait that always predicts leadership. And I think it's pretty common sense just thinking about this, that certain situations are going to actually require certain different traits to be a successful leader. There are times when you probably want something very smart to be a leader. There's other times where that might actually basically stall the leadership process. So if you've got someone that's very thoughtful and intelligent and they're in a leadership position where there is time to think things over thoroughly, there's time to kind of really consider all the alternatives, then that trait, intelligence, is probably going to be highly predicted to leadership. But if you have a situation where someone is needing to make immediate gut level calls second to second without thinking about it in detail, intelligence may actually be a detriment at that point. Likewise, dominance. There may be some situations where you need a very charismatic but also dominant personality to be able to control their subordinates. But in other situations, that might result in backlash, as people that are used to autonomy suddenly have a very dominant leader and react negatively to it. So the trait theories, again, they found some evidence, and in fact the list there is various studies during this time. There were studies that found that men tended to be better leaders than women in most situations, that people that had higher levels of dominance often at least became leaders, that intelligence tended to be related in some situations to successful leadership. Appearance, actually both height and attractiveness, were somewhat related to the emergence of a leader. And that's another important thing to kind of recognize when we talk about leaders, is there's two things that we often have to kind of piece apart in this. Whether someone becomes a leader or not is often predicted by different things than whether that leader is then successful once they become a leader. So, for instance, gender was more related to whether someone made it into a leadership role. Men, especially in the 1930s and 50s, were much more likely to emerge as a leader. Those people that are dominant are more likely to emerge as a leader. People that are attractive and tall and healthy looking are more likely to be chosen for leadership roles. But once they're in that role, do they actually become a good leader? That's where a lot of these theories fell apart. So the trait theories are a little bit more useful for just predicting who's likely to rise to the top to become a leader. They're not very useful at giving us ideas about what happens once they become a leader. So in the past 25 years, interest in traits has somewhat reemerged. So we have been seeing more research on it, and again, intelligence, dominance, masculine orientation does predict leader emergence in small groups. So what I was talking about in the last slide about the fact that trait theories are better at predicting who emerges as a leader has kind of come back into vogue, if you will. It's more, we're seeing research on it, because the previous studies in the 30s and 50s was not just trying to figure out emergence, it was trying to predict who becomes an effective leader. So trait theories today are not really used to predict successful leadership, they're used to predict who's more likely to try to become a leader. Also, the trait theory has found that behavioral flexibility, so a trait, the ability to change your behavior depending on the situation, so the extent to which an individual is willing to consider what behaviors or approaches might work best in a particular situation, also is a fairly useful predictor of leader emergence in small groups. So again, in small groups with varied projects, if whoever is more behaviorally flexible is more likely to emerge as the leader. There's also been some recent research that they're now also in the 30s and 50s, 30s through 50s, personality measurement wasn't as advanced as it is today. So we have moved on to coming up with some fairly solid constructs of what are stable traits in people. So the big 5 personality traits, there has been some research that has found that extroversion, for instance, is fairly well related to success of leadership, and again, leadership emergence. Also, leadership self-efficacy and individuals' perceived capacity to successfully accomplish leadership's tasks is also related to both leadership emergence but also leadership success. And this kind of makes a certain amount of sense, but that's something we can measure then. So if leadership self-efficacy, this belief that you can lead, is a predictor of whether you'll become a leader and is a predictor of your success if you do become a leader, that means that's a predictor we can use. We can give people a test of leadership self-efficacy to try to predict who's going to be more likely to become a leader and more likely to become a successful leader. So that's where we're at with trait theories today. Behavioral theories came out after trait theories in the 1960s and 70s, and they really were a reaction to the failure of the trait theories to really come up with information about who emerges as a leader successfully in all situations, and also, more importantly, who succeeds once they become a leader. So if traits were not useful in understanding the leadership process, perhaps looking at what a leader actually does would be more helpful. So we're back to Kurt Lewin. We've talked about him before in this class. He was, again, primarily a social psychologist, but he was very interested in applied social psychology, and specifically in studying social interactions, that though he was interested in just kind of the general research of it, almost all of his studies were directly applicable to both military leadership but also organizational leadership, which is one of the reasons that Kurt Lewin is often cited as one of the founders of organizational psychology, even though he wasn't even thinking in those terms when he was doing his research. So one of the things he was interested in was what was referred to the Iowa studies, which was a whole series of studies trying to, again, come up with a model for how do leaders emerge, and once they emerge, how do they become successful. And again, this was a descriptive study, but instead of trying to find the traits associated with leadership, he was looking at what behaviors are associated with leadership. So basically, he found 3 types of leadership style. He referred to them as authoritarian, democratic, and laissez-faire. So authoritarian leaders are those who their behaviors are fairly authoritarian or dictatorial. They make decisions, they use power, and they influence others very directly. And it is a very hierarchical way to do leadership. In other words, you give orders. The military would be a very good example of an authoritarian leadership system. So those are authoritarian leadership styles. Those are behaviors. The democratic style is more of collaborative and seeking feedback from those subordinates. So a democratic leader will generally bring in his subordinates or her subordinates and ask them for their opinions, will do brainstorming, and will often allow even votes occasionally to determine what's going to happen. So they're not using their coercion or reward power. They're trying to use expert and reverent power. And finally, laissez-faire leadership behaviors. These are basically avoidant leaders. Leaders that are trying not to make decisions, leaders that are trying to stay under the radar, leaders that really are just kind of hoping that their subordinates will perform well without their help. So research from these studies did find that subordinates preferred democratic leaders, but there wasn't much of a relationship between these 3 leadership styles and subordinate behaviors. So we often still will talk about authoritarian, democratic, and laissez-faire leadership styles, more so, though, as a way to categorize leadership. There's not a lot of strong support that authoritarian style is always an effective leadership style, that democratic leadership is always an effective leadership style, or that laissez-faire is always an ineffective leadership style. Again, it's more complex than that. It depends on the situation. There are times when a laissez-faire leader will probably be more successful, especially if it's like a small company with very autonomous, very highly skilled and highly motivated employees. If you've got 20 research scientists that all are self-motivated, internally motivated, and just working to get things done, if you suddenly put an authoritarian leader in there that's barking orders and changing everything, you're probably going to get backlash and a reduction in performance. That might be a situation where a laissez-faire leader is going to be a better leader. So again, just categorizing leaders to try to predict whether they'll be successful or not gave us some more descriptive information, but it didn't necessarily give us that universal law of what is a good leader. So the Ohio State studies followed up on this in the 60s and 70s. So they're another behavioral series. And the Ohio State studies, they basically came up with the Leader Opinion Questionnaire, the LOQ, and the Leader Behavior Descriptive Questionnaire, LBDQ. And what they used from this is they did basically the same kind of analysis that was used to create the Big Five personality. They were looking for, basically what these questionnaires were asking was they asked leaders a whole bunch of questions about what their opinions of being leaders were. And then they asked their subordinates to describe all the behaviors they saw. And then they were asking, is there underlying constructs of leadership hidden behind all these hundreds of questions we're asking? And they actually did find two major dimensions of leadership behavior. Initiating structure and consideration is what they call them. Now, this idea that there is two major dimensions of leadership behavior has been parroted, and by parroted I mean basically repeated over and over again with slightly different names by a lot of different researchers. So initiating structure is sometimes called task significance. It's sometimes called basically, its initiating structure is the behaviors through which leaders define their roles in achieving the group's goals, assign specific tasks, plan ahead, and defining procedures. Initiating structure basically means that you're task focused. You're trying to get the job done. And that's your main focus, is if you are very high in initiating structure, your leadership style is all about influencing people to produce. You're about the bottom line. You're about increasing productivity. Consideration, often referred to as also social or warmth, is the extent to which leaders act in a supportive way and show concern and respect for their subordinates. Two-way communication, establishing a favorable rapport, basically treating people like people. And in a way, another way to think of initiating structure and consideration is initiating structure is a little bit more theory X. Drive people to do their best. Consideration is a little bit more theory Y. Show people respect and they'll do it themselves. So leaders are not necessarily one type or the other. In other words, every leader can be measured on these two constructs. You can be either high, medium, or low on initiating structure, or you can be either high, medium, or low on consideration. The most important contribution of the behavioral approach to leadership is the classification of leadership behaviors into this dimension. So this has been fairly supported. Now again, there's a little bit of depends here, and we'll talk about that as we talk about this theory in a little bit more detail. So not always is high initiating going to be important. Again, high initiating structure would be very similar to kind of the authoritarian leadership style. And then sometimes there's going to be situations where that kind of leadership is going to cause problems in the subordinates. So specific research findings have been inconsistent. No one set of behaviors has emerged as predictive of effective leadership across all studies. But there has been a fair amount of research that says that in most situations, there is an advantage to being high on initiating structure and high on consideration. So this is typically the idea that we look at as the dimensions of leadership behavior. So this is that, again, initiating structure by consideration. And the idea is that you can basically make a grid, if you will, out of these two. So going up and down the vertical axis is consideration. So at the very bottom is very low in consideration. So that's a leader that really doesn't care about people at all, or at least doesn't show it in any meaningful way. And all the way at the top is someone that's very high in consideration. They're very much thinking about the social lives and how people are going to interact and react to their leadership. People matter to this person. Across the horizontal axis, we have initiating structure. So again, very low initiating structure is a leader that almost never is dictating anything. They are not necessarily driven to get the task done. They're basically just letting their subordinates do whatever their subordinates do. And again, all the way up to high, and in a high situation, that's where they're very task focused. They're very much about bottom line and getting the job done. So by combining these two, we basically come up with four broad types of leadership. So the first one would be very low concern for production and high concern for people. So that's basically that top left area. And I'm going to use World War II military examples because I'm a bit of a closet historian. So that's Omar Bradley. He was known as the GI general during World War II. He actually was a fairly successful general, and actually, so it's a little bit, it isn't that he necessarily was low on initiating structure, it's more of his reputation. His reputation was that he was more concerned about protecting his soldiers and reducing the casualties in his army than he was necessarily for taking risks to get the job done. So if he had the choice between losing 10,000 men and taking a city today and losing 2,000 men but taking 2 weeks to take that city, he'd go for the losing less men. So he was more concerned for the people than he was for the actual task. So broadly speaking, he would be a low concern for production and a high concern for people. Now again, generally speaking, this is a very popular leader, but it may not be necessarily an effective leader, especially if the organization needs someone to be driving the organization more towards production. Now, if you have a group of people that are already highly productive, they don't need to be driven, they know their jobs, and they're self-motivated, then actually this might be a good leader for that situation, because they're going to be very well liked, and they're going to be mainly focused on high concern for their employees, making sure everyone stays happy, which will reduce turnover and keep people more likely to stay in the organization. So the direct opposite of that, and in this case I've got General Patton from World War II, is a very high concern for production and a very low concern for people. Now, and again, this is more the stereotype about Patton. If you've read any histories about him, there's a fair amount of evidence that he actually really did care deeply for his troops. But again, his opinion was, if I can take a city in a day, it's better to take it as quick as I can, because I think that will result in less losses overall than if I took a long time. So his thinking reflects this very high concern for production, get the job done, with not much concern for the actual people or how people are perceiving them. So generally this kind of leader is not going to be well liked, but will be fairly effective at getting the job done. Low concern for production and low concern for people. These are actually fairly hard leaders to find. I've got General Custer here. I actually broke away from World War II on this one. And again, the stereotype of General Custer. So definitely his decisions did not result in high effective leadership as production. His military unit was wiped out. And also he was generally not well liked and did not show a lot of concern for his troops, at least the stereotype of him again. There are a few situations where this still might be a good kind of leader if you've got a situation where, again, the people are already happy, they don't want to be messed with. They basically, what they're wanting from management is, leave us alone and we'll get the job done. And if they're capable of getting the job done if left alone, then this might be the kind of leader you want. Most of the time, though, we're wanting to move our leaders away from this box. So generally speaking, in most situations, we're wanting leaders to be high in at least one of the other, consideration or initiating structure. And again, ideally, we want them high in both. Most situations, and this is, again, not 100% supported, as there are situations where this is not going to be a successful leadership style, but leaders that show the behavior of a high concern for production and a high concern for people, and in this case I've got General Dwight D. Eisenhower from World War II. And again, the reputation and perception, the stereotypes of his leadership style, was that he was very focused on getting the task done, winning World War II, but he also was very concerned with how his leadership decisions would affect other people and keeping track of how that actually was interacting amongst the various allies and different military units and also governments that he was having to work with. So a lot of times, the way this theory is utilized in the real world is through grid training. So again, we've now got, this is another example of the same idea but slightly different terms. So instead of initiating structure, we now have concern for production. Instead of, we've got concern for people instead of social, and in this case, the idea is to actually measure your leaders and then find where they fall on this grid. So the first thing you do as an organizational consultant, if you were being asked to use grid training to make better leaders, is you would measure each leader on these two dimensions, concern for people, concern for production. And you'd identify where they were. So the 9-1 pattern in the far bottom right is very task-focused management. The very top one is called country club management, the 9-1 pattern at the top left. So that's very high concern for people, low concern for productivity. The 1-1 pattern, which would be somewhat referred to as laissez-faire leadership, they referred to as impoverished management. And finally, there's the 9-9 pattern, team management, the ideal style. Now again, research doesn't support that team management is always going to be successful management in all situations. but it is generally better received and results in a fair amount of positive outcomes in most situations, which is why policies or theories like grid training is used. So once you actually measure these, and there's measures that basically, so this grid training comes with a set of self-assessed questionnaires that identify where you are. The organizational consultant would then be training you or coaching you on how to move on this grid. So, for example, if I took it and I came up as a 5-5 middle of the road manager, I'm somewhat concerned for production, I'm somewhat concerned for people. The organizational consultant would then work with me to increase my focus on task and concern for people to try to slowly move me up to that 9-9 pattern, the ideal team management style.